Mr. Merschlense. Now we will have here in the plenary session the Freedom of Speech Award.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Deutsche Welle Freedom of Speech Award, hosted by Jana Paragas.
Welcome to this year's Freedom of Speech Award here at the Global Media Forum in Bonn. With this award, DW honors people who promote free speech and human rights. And today, this award will go to one of the leading, courageous journalists from a country where the freedom of the press is heavily under attack. And the laudatory speech will be given by one of the most powerful and influential men in European media. 140 characters can be enough these days to put a journalist in Turkey on trial. That's how long a tweet can be, and a tweet in an article can land Sedat Ergin, chief editor of the Turkish daily newspaper Hürriyet, into prison for up to 4 years. Sedat Ergin is accused of insulting the Turkish President Erdogan. For his fight for freedom of the press, Sedat Ergin today will be honored with the Freedom of Speech Award. So first of all, I would like to ask Peter Limburg, the Director General of DW, to join me on stage. Peter Limburg, why does Deutsche Welle has decided to honor a Turkish journalist this year with the Freedom of Speech Award?
Well, first of all, I think it's the person of Sedat Ergin, who is a really courageous journalist, as you just mentioned, and he has a real difficult time in his country, but he's courageous, fighting for freedom of press. And the other reason is that looking at Turkey makes us really anxious concerning freedom and values, because nearly every journalist who is only a bit critical to the government is being prosecuted, is being tied to the courts. And I've happened to be there several times in the last month, and I've seen journalists who are really doing only their job, and there's nothing conspiracy, there's nothing special. They're doing their job in refugee camps, they're doing jobs in cities where you have a lot of refugees. And they are also afraid of being prosecuted. They are already sentenced. And I think this is a situation where we, in a relatively commod situation, we have to act. We have to say this is not longer tolerable. And this is why we choose Turkey. And Turkey obviously is something which is concerned to Germany. It's always a special relation, and we're very happy that we have so many Turkish friends and so many Turkish-based citizens here in Germany. But and also it's possible to have different opinions on the Armenian question or whatever. It's okay if you have different opinions. But these insults towards journalists and now also towards German politicians is simply not tolerable. And we just want to send a signal out to Turkey. We don't want this, and please stop this.
Now, Turkey is just one of many countries where the freedom of the press is limited. What is your general outlook of the state of the freedom of the press in the world?
Oh, it's a difficult task for us, and I think it's an uphill battle. But on the other hand, I'm also an optimist, and I think when you look at history, in most of the cases, freedom of expression and the idea of liberal and free expression of people and freedom has won. It is always in danger, and there are always setbacks, but at the end, I think it will win, and either it will come through revolutions, it will come through evolution, come to a peaceful process, hopefully, but I'm optimistic, but it takes a lot of work, and it takes also the encouragement of people in Western Europe or in the United States or whatever in the world who are able to have a free press and to be maybe a role model for others and to show the example and to help others that they can win this fight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter Limburg. And we will now have a short video for you looking at the situation in Turkey.
Turkey, a democracy under threat. Demonstrators demanding greater freedom of the press. Police responding with tear gas and water cannon. A government tightening its control over unwelcome newspapers like Zaman in March. It's now under state supervision, forced to toe the party line. Other journalists receiving threats, facing criminal charges. Turkey is an EU candidate country, and yet, according to Reporters Without Borders, there are hardly any countries with greater restrictions on their press. Turkey sits at position 151 of 180. Below Tajikistan, just ahead of DR Congo. The main person responsible for all this is Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Having filed nearly 2,000 suits for alleged insult, the president is clearly attempting to silence his critics with the help of anti-terrorist laws. There's no difference between a terrorist and those who exploit their title and position and put everything at terrorists' disposal to achieve their objectives. The fact that he or she is a member of parliament, an academic, a writer or journalist doesn't change the fact that he or she is a terrorist. Europe is dependent on Turkey in the migrant crisis and has to be open to compromise. Does this include freedom of the press? Deutsche Welle's Freedom of Speech Award this year goes to Sedat Ergin, editor-in-chief of the independent newspaper Hürriyet. Our intention is clear. Deutsche Welle calls for greater freedom of the press in Turkey.
And to honor Sedat Ergin, Deutsche Welle is more than pleased to welcome one of the most influential personalities in German and European media, the publisher of Germany's most widely read daily newspaper, BILD Zeitung. Welcome, Kai Diekmann.
Ladies and gentlemen, when on the evening of September 8, Sedat Ergin stormed into the live TV show of CNN Turk in Istanbul, the viewers held their breath. He said, "We are under attack." And the editor-in-chief of Hürriyet did not mean that in principle, in the sense of the freedom of the press is under attack or the freedom of the word, the freedom of opinion or the editor's right to criticize what they think is going wrong. He did not mean that, even though that was true as well. Sedat Ergin meant exactly what he was saying live in front of the camera. At that very moment, an angry mob of supporters of the Islamic conservative governing party AKP tried to storm the office building of Hürriyet. The attackers had arrived in trucks. They had stones and wooden sleds. They shouted Allahu Akbar and praised the Turkish president. They quickly managed to overpower the few helpless police officers at the entrance. The editorial staff's building was about to be taken over. In the last second, private security managed to shut the entrance door behind them. The only chance of calling for help that Sedat Ergin could see was CNN Turk's live broadcasting that was being recorded in the building next door. He did not do this for publicity. It was an act of necessity. After painfully long minutes, finally more police officers arrived. Only 2 days earlier, 200 AKP supporters had already stormed the Hürriyet premises and smashed the windows. The brutal attack on the newspaper had, however, no consequences at all. No official condemnation of the attack by the government. No sign of regret. No sign of solidarity or sympathy. No support for the press at all, which by law is supposed to be free in Turkey too. One of the protest leaders, an AKP politician, can be seen on a video saying, "We are to blame for not giving Sedat Ergin a beating when we should have." But there was no investigation against this politician. Quite the opposite. He was promoted. Now, he is the Deputy Minister for Sports and the Youth. This officially makes him a role model. I'm very happy that Sedat Ergin is being honored with the Freedom of Speech Award today. And we have to congratulate Deutsche Welle for the decision and be grateful for it. There could hardly have been a more worthy winner of the award. Sedat Ergin is not only a man of great character. He is not only an outstanding journalist with 40 years of experience, and he is not only a great editor-in-chief. He is also a courageous man, and he's always been. So I'm delightful and I'm very grateful that Deutsche Welle had asked me to give this speech today. Not only because Turkey is a place where I and my family have spent so much time over the years, but also because, as a board member, I have enjoyed close ties with my colleagues from Hürriyet since 2004. I can tell you, it is dangerous to be an editor-in-chief in Turkey. It always was. One of Sedat Ergin's predecessors was murdered. Sedat Ergin himself is now in danger of losing his freedom. In Istanbul, as we heard before, he is being tried for insulting the Turkish president. Hürriyet was said to have quoted the president in a mistakable way on its online site. The newspaper promptly apologized for that. Still, a trial against editor-in-chief Ergin began. If he were to be judged guilty, he would face 4 years of prison. Let me repeat this in order to let the injustice that our colleagues are subjected to sink in. After 2 violent attacks with stones and clubs on his editorial staff, the editor-in-chief is now facing 4 years in prison. 4 years because of one article. When the trial began, Sedat painted a gloomy picture. He said, "The freedom of press in Turkey in 2016 is limited to courthouse corridors." With 360,000 daily copies, Hürriyet is the leading medium for the secular center of Turkish society. The Hürriyet editorial staff and their brave publisher, Mrs. Vuslat Doğan Sabanci, have declared that they will not back down. They will not be shut up. They will carry on despite everything. It was on that same morning that Mrs. Doğan and her 3 sisters joined arms together, surrounded by Sedat Ergin and hundreds of journalists in the name of freedom and democracy to protect the very foundation that their father, Aydin Doğan, built over the last many decades in Turkey and for Turkey. This act of courage by the 4 Doğan sisters is in so many ways only possible because of the strength that is central to Mr. Aydin Doğan's love for his country, Turkey. Sedat Ergin and his colleagues want to continue reporting objectively, liberally, independently, just as Hürriyet has been doing for the last 70 years. One reason for their determination is also that Sedat Ergin is not the only one threatened at Hürriyet with imprisonment. His predecessor and our columnist at BILD, Ertuğrul Özkök, is also being tried because of supposedly insulting the president. By the way, Ertuğrul is, since over a decade now, one of my very best personal friends. For us journalists in Germany, it is important and correct to criticize politics and its representatives. But let's be honest. What do we journalists risk in doing so in this country? Fortunately for us, nothing, absolutely nothing. But only 3 flight hours away from Berlin or Bonn, every day in Turkey, journalists risk everything. This drastically shows us what a valuable and noble good the freedom of the press is. Our Turkish colleagues, they risk their jobs, their physical integrity, their health, their freedom. They risk their lives. Colleagues like Sedat Ergin. Let's take a look at the facts. The fact that the Doğan Media Group, who is the publisher of Hürriyet, was pressured with a tax fine of approximately $2.5 billion in 2009 is perhaps the most explicit proof of the price the Doğan Group has paid for an independent journalism. This unfounded demand for fines was big enough to make it into the Guinness Book of Records, and it is exceeding the value of the total assets of the group. The independent organization's Reporters Without Borders ranking of freedom, as we just heard, of the press, has Turkey nowadays in place 151. This is a drop of 53 places in only 10 years. Hürriyet columnist Ahmad was beaten up by 4 men in front of his house. 3 of them were AKP members. Hakan had to go to hospital with a broken nose and broken ribs. For 2 weeks before the attack, he had been asking for police protection in vain. Some newspapers are now controlled by so-called state qayyum, mandatory custodians. Formerly critical and independent papers suddenly praise the political conditions in their country after the custodians have taken over. George Orwell couldn't have imagined it any better. Between 2011 and 2014, there were over 150 gag orders in Turkey. The Greek photographer Georgios Mustafis was not allowed to enter Turkey when working for BILD. At the airport, he was detained for 12 hours and then sent back. He was told that he was on a list. He never learned what kind of list this was supposed to be. But non-existing transparency is the opposite of rule of law. ARD correspondent Volker Schwenk and other journalists were also rejected at the Turkish borders. According to a record of the Turkish Journalists Union, 247 journalists who reported about the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul in 2013 were fired. And let us also not forget Can Dündar, the editor-in-chief of Hürriyet. He was condemned to almost 6 years in prison, and his colleague Erdem Gül to 5 years, the accusation publishing secret documents. So what's now? What's the solution? What should we do? It's not quite correct to claim that Germany or the EU do not criticize the harassment of our Turkish colleagues. Yes, there is criticism. But is it actually loud enough, given the incredible injustice that we are witnessing? Germany and the European Union, we have to ask ourselves, are we too lenient with NATO member and eternal EU membership candidate Turkey for pragmatic reasons? We have to face a very ugly question. Has Europe become so skeptical to blackmail because of the refugee deal with Turkey? To what degree is the European Union now in the hands of the Turkish government? If it is no longer possible for the EU to take a stand and to set a clear and loud sign for the value of the freedom of the press and the freedom of opinion. A sign addressed to all of those who do not care for this value. A sign supporting all of those who desperately fight for their rights in Turkey. Germany and the European Union, we have a duty. We must not tire of addressing the terrible state of the freedom of the press and opinion in Turkey. We have to do this in a no uncertain manner. Hürriyet is one of the last remaining loud voices in Turkey. It is the burning torch of freedom, one of the last bastions of the free world. The people in Turkey, they deserve a free and independent press. And the journalists deserve to be sure that they are not risking prison as soon as they have typed their first sentence. By the way, Hürriyet means freedom. Currently, this name is not a description of reality. It is rather a reminder of and a hope for better times. As long as Sedat Ergin and his courageous editors continue their work and will not be silenced, I do not want to give up my hope that there will be better times in Turkey again. Let us do everything to make sure that the loud voices of our courageous colleagues will never fall silent. Dear Sedat, you at Hürriyet, you can be very proud of yourselves. My deepest congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Diekmann. Mr. Diekmann, Mr. Limburg, please come on stage. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Sedat Ergin, this year's recipient of the Freedom of Speech Award. Now, Sedat Ergin, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, first of all, I should begin by expressing my gratitude to Diekmann, my dear friend, for his strong laudation speech. Dear Kai, I'm really heartened and touched by your strong words of support and praise for me, for my colleagues, and for my newspaper, Hürriyet. Thank you for your time and effort to come here all the way from Berlin to deliver this speech with passion. And thank you for your principled stance in defending freedom of the press. It's a great honor for me to be the recipient of the Deutsche Welle Freedom of Speech Award today. Firstly, I would like to express my thanks to the board of directors of the Deutsche Welle for considering me and my newspaper worthy of this award. I would like to also take this opportunity to extend my greetings to Peter Limburg, the Director General of Deutsche Welle. I will always remember his visit to our newspaper to demonstrate his support for us after the headquarters of our newspaper was attacked twice in early September last year. This visit had demonstrated to us how valuable and meaningful solidarity among journalists is when any of us is attacked and freedom of the press is targeted. Thank you, Mr. Limburg. I must confess that I have rather mixed feelings about receiving this award. Awards are generally meant to bring contentment to their recipients. However, receiving an award for freedom of expression is not such a happy occasion. When the subject of the award you have received is freedom of expression, the troubling state of that freedom is inevitably highlighted. And this award also carries a message regarding the state of freedom of expression in my country. I must point out that a slight bitterness hangs over my feelings. As I was thinking about the content of my speech, a number of thoughts ran through my mind. Freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental values of humankind. It is an essential part, an integral part of our existence in human societies. And anything that takes away from us this sine qua non of our existence is against the ideals of humanity and against our very dignity. We can tell the history of humanity on various levels. On one level, history consists of the history of conflict between those who wish to pave the path for freedom of expression and those who wish to restrict and block this freedom. In this is included the story of those who paid huge prices for freedom of speech. This price has included people's lives, their exiles, iron bars, oppression, and grief under various methods of pressure and terror. The history of my country is the story of the high prices paid in this respect. I come from a country that has lost many reputable journalists and writers to assassinations and terrorism. One of my predecessors as editor-in-chief in my newspaper, Hürriyet, Çetin Emeç, is also included in this list. What is saddening is that in the year 2016, our world is still going through grave problems, anxieties, and agonies when it comes to freedom of expression. The fact that awards have to be given to preserve freedom of expression is a clear proof of this. This is because the conditions requiring such awards to be given, and therefore the presence of a significant need to support freedom of expression, are still present. Unfortunately, recent reports by all reputable organizations that monitor the course of human rights and freedom of expression indicate a general downward trend in this area around the world. All these reports reveal an increasing threat to freedom of expression. According to the recent report by the internationally acclaimed Freedom House on the condition of global political rights and civil liberties, freedom in the world in 2015 registered an overall decline for the 9th consecutive year. According to the Freedom House, acceptance of democracy as the world's dominant form of government and of an international system built on democratic ideals is under greater threat than at any point in the last 25 years. And when we talk about freedom of speech, a new global problem which has not been fully diagnosed yet is emerging before us. This problem is that issues related to freedom of expression are increasingly apparent not only in third world countries, dictatorships, and monarchies, but also in countries claiming to be democracies. I'm talking about cases where all the formal requirements of a democracy are present in appearance, in form, but in practice, freedom of expression and freedom of the press are actually restricted. As a result, the substance of democracy is diluted. This is one of the biggest threats facing democracies today. Today, there are many crippled democratic practices across the world. Political scientists are busy finding new definitions for these practices. They have coined terms such as electoral authoritarianism, illiberal democracy, populist authoritarianism. All these practices have a common denominator. They all aim to control the flow of information to society through various methods and mechanisms and to restrict citizens' access to information. Such models, operating under the appearance of a democracy, make it more difficult to diagnose and address problems in the area of freedom of expression that are encountered. What needs to be worrying for us is the fact that the European continent is no longer immune to this authoritarian tendency. Today, there are countries with declining democratic standards in Europe. There are even EU members among them. Poland is following the bad precedent set by Hungary in recent years. It is not possible to say that the situation is any different in most of the Balkan states which are taking steps towards full EU membership. At the turn of the century, the greater European project undertook a massive step of enlargement to incorporate Eastern and Central European countries. With that enlargement, these countries would be transformed to appreciate the values of democracy, the rule of law, an open society, and a market economy. Sadly, this project has lately entered a period of stagnation and even crisis. There is currently a heated debate about how Europe can protect its universal values. There is widespread criticism that the measures taken about refugees are moving Europe away from its own values. We are going through times where xenophobia, intolerance, racism, hate speech, Islamophobia, authoritarianism, a polarizing rhetoric of us versus them, and a populist discourse are rapidly gaining ground. Specters that we thought were left in the previous century are surfacing again. And yet, we had been so optimistic about the future of Europe when the Berlin Wall came down and the Iron Curtain crumbled at the beginning of the 1990s. Some even declared this was the end of the social and political evolution of humankind, and that we had reached the end of history. The era of liberal democracy had started, and the course of history had taken an irreversibly progressive course. It would not be wrong to say that Francis Fukuyama had too naive an outlook when one looks at the world today. The situation poses a big challenge for European institutions. These structures, founded after the end of the Second World War, play a vital role in establishing, preserving, and strengthening values such as democracy, the rule of law, and freedom of expression. Through its institutional evolution, the European Union became the pinnacle of such model. However, these institutions no longer exert the same kind of influence when it comes to preserving the values and ideals defining Europe's identity in the present day. As they cannot preserve their own values, European institutions are also losing their moral authority. I would like to address this issue in the context of my country, a candidate to become an EU member. The accession process is usually expected to be an assurance for a candidate country, as it is meant to enhance the latter's democratic standards and to pave the path for the protection of freedom of expression. Indeed, the EU had a major transformative impact in all Eastern Bloc countries during the post-1990 expansion period in their efforts to build functional democratic institutions. The accession process of Turkey, which began at the end of 1999, had a similar effect during its initial stages. Indeed, in the early stages of the process, major democratization reforms were introduced in Turkey. Many taboos started to be discussed, and eventually the boundaries of freedom of expression steadily expanded. I'm talking here as someone, as a journalist, who witnessed that era and who benefited from the improvements that the process brought about. When Turkey's candidacy for full membership was announced at the EU summit in Helsinki in December 1999, and when in the Brussels summit in December 2004, when it was decided to commence negotiations, and finally when the negotiations actually commenced in October 2005 in Strasbourg, I remember the power of the wave of optimism that swept across Turkey. We were all enthusiastic and full of hopes for the future of our country. The mood was really upbeat. That optimistic atmosphere has now been replaced by pessimism and uncertainty. There is no doubt that both parties bear responsibility for this. In particular, Germany and France altered their stance about Turkey's full membership. This change of position had a significant effect in deflating the reform enthusiasm in Turkey. However, it has also affected, particularly after 2009, there was a stagnation in the reform process in Turkey. The tendency to deviate from the reform process gradually emerged and gained momentum. It is also a fact that as such tendencies emerged and their consequences became all too visible, the European Union demonstrated a major institutional failure to detect, read, and analyze this deviation. When we look at the European Commission's recent Turkey progress reports, we see a growing trend of criticism on freedom of expression and democracy. Every year, the volume of criticism increases. Is there not a conflict here? Theoretically, it is expected that the accession process elevates a candidate country's democracy. However, in the case of Turkey, the accession process has not functioned as a protective shield or insurance for the health of our democracy. It cannot be denied that this situation is an institutional problem and a failure from an EU standpoint. Had that protective shield functioned, I would not be receiving a Freedom of Expression Award here on this stage today. I am the editor-in-chief of a major newspaper, and every day I have to go out in public with a security detail. Moreover, following the physical attacks against our newspaper last September and a beating suffered by one of our leading columnists, my newspaper had to allocate an armored car for me. It cannot be common for the editor-in-chief of the biggest newspaper of an EU candidate country to go about with a bodyguard in an armored car. On the 41st year of my professional life, this is the point I have come to. When full membership negotiations started a decade ago, it would never have crossed my mind that I would find myself in this situation in 2016. What was inconceivable then is the reality of the present. There is a long list of problems currently faced by journalists in Turkey. Unfortunately, physical attacks have been recently added to this list. It would not be fair for me to complain about my problems while there are graver issues faced by my colleagues. When you go to courthouses, it is no coincidence to see journalists waiting in the hallways for their trials. Hundreds of investigations or cases have been either initiated or filed against journalists with accusations such as insulting senior officials or advocacy of terrorism. Trials of journalists and columnists have taken up a considerable portion of our coverage in recent months. I myself am also on trial for a sentence up to 4 years of imprisonment for insulting the president due to our coverage of a news story. Last March, I was before the judge as a defendant for the first time in my life. As a journalist, I had always been to courtrooms in my capacity as a reporter in the past. Sitting in the defendant's seat, standing up before the judge, gives one a very different feeling. Meanwhile, imprisonment of colleagues, long detentions for those who are indicted, and sentences that send them away to jail are other serious sources of concern. One dimension of the problem in Turkey is a legislation that makes it possible to easily prosecute journalists. Moreover, the heavy-handed interpretation of the already restrictive legislation by some prosecutors and judges makes journalists' lives even more difficult. For instance, the Doğan Media Group has been under investigation for the last 7 months on allegations of providing support for terrorism. When all is said and done, when all these practices are put together, it obviously creates a chilling effect on freedom of expression. I'm the editor-in-chief of the biggest newspaper of the leading media group in Turkey, and the stance of an editor-in-chief is above all also a reflection of the will of the publisher behind them. If I have been able to pursue my mission as an editor, it is in large part thanks to the will behind me. Doğan Group's pursuit of independent journalism is one of the most important guarantees of freedom of expression and freedom of the press in Turkey. We only want to do our job, and we want to do it in line with universal criteria. As a group, we paid a high price for this, particularly after 2009, and we are continuing to do so. The attacks against our newspaper are only a small part of this price. The list of the unfair practices faced by our group is quite long, but it would not be proper for me to list our issues here today. In any case, the award I am receiving will be a great incentive for me and my colleagues to continue on the path towards the goal of independent journalism as we know it. With this opportunity, I would like to thank the Board of Directors of Deutsche Welle once again. As I am receiving this award, I would also like to convey my feelings of solidarity to all fellow journalists across the world who have been deprived of their freedom behind iron bars, or who are intimidated with threats of legal reprisal or various methods of oppression. Beyond the recipient individuals and institutions, the greatest significance of these awards like this is the contribution they make to dignify the ideal of freedom of expression, which is one of the most vital components of a democracy. The very fact that we have gathered here to support freedom of expression is meaningful enough. Maintaining our resolve to sustain the ideal of freedom of expression is the most effective response to those who fear such freedom and who wish to eliminate it. Before ending my speech, please allow me to express very briefly the immense disappointment in Turkey caused by the resolution of the German Bundestag very recently defining the events of 1915 as genocide. The resolution is viewed as unfair and unacceptable by the majority of the Turkish people, and my sentiments are not that different. Yes, there is a need for reconciliation between the two neighboring nations, but as a resolution adopted as such by the Bundestag would only have a counterproductive effect on such efforts. Needless to say, the resolution will adversely affect the relations between Turkey and Germany and further complicate this relationship. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Ergin. The Freedom of Speech Award 2016 goes to Sedat Ergin, Chief Editor of the Turkish daily newspaper Hürriyet. Thank you for joining us here at the Global Media Forum in Bonn at DW's awards ceremony, and thank you for watching.